Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar sponsored by the Chicago DOE Alliance Center, or CDAC. This is our first webinar of the 2024-2025 academic year, and it's a pleasure to introduce one of our own, Adam Denchfield. Adam is a graduate student in physics, supported by CDAC, and is finishing up his PhD thesis in the coming months. Adam is a computational condensed matter physicist with an interest in the electronic, magnetic, and superconducting properties of materials such as nickelates, rare earth tellurides, manganites, and most recently, hydrides. I think his work is distinguished by the close attention he pays to experimental detail, and he actually interacts a lot with our experimental group. So it's a pleasure having him in our group. Adam has a bachelor's from Illinois Institute of Technology, and as I mentioned, he'll be finishing up his PhD, so I believe he's on the lookout for interesting postdoctoral positions in the coming year. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Russ. Yeah, I will say I pride myself on for such an important topic as near ambient superconductivity, like in these binary hydrides. I do pride myself on having studied vociferously the relevant literature. In particular, regarding the materials that I'm going to discuss today, which are the rare earth trihydrides and their doped variants, which I will argue there's a decent amount of evidence for there being potentially high TC superconductivity in them at modest pressures, 5 to 20 GPa, maybe lower depending on the material. So there's a couple ways you can motivate the work that I've been doing. One is theoretical on the left, some work by Villa-Cortez and De La Peña-Simón, which is looking at the hole doping of hole and electron doping, but I'll focus on the hole doping of scandium and yttrium trihydrides in their FCC form, which they found that hole doping not only increased the electron-phonon coupling, that's this color you see here, but also increased the stability of the FCC lattice for a couple reasons. There's competing instabilities by the rare earth sublattice versus the hydrogen sublattice. So that's why you can get an increase in electron-phonon coupling, but also an increase in FCC stability. So very interesting results there. They got TCs up to about 90 Kelvin. And on the right are reports by Russ Hemley's own group, the group at UIC, measuring samples of a nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride that seems to have a very sharp resistivity drop at low pressures, like 10 kilobar, 15 kilobar, at very high temperatures. And one of the leading theories is that there's a little nitrogen and it's close to LuH3, but the door is wide open on that right now. A lot of theorists have been looking at it. A lot of experimentalists have been looking at it. So my question going into this, I did some work understanding the nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride system, and then I thought to myself, can I generalize this to other elements, like other rare earths, other dopants even, other than nitrogen? So what I came up with are a series of basically 3 successively more complex hydrides, multi-component hydrides, like a quaternary Fm3m structure on the left, a up to quintary structure in the middle, and an even more complex structure on the right. And the proposal is that since these are all based on the rare earth trihydrides, they should basically on the FCC version specifically, they should kind of adopt similar stability properties, meaning they should be stable in the 10 to 20 GPa range. But these dopants will allow tuning of the electronic properties for superconductivity. The issue is, how can we possibly estimate TC for like these larger heterostructures, for example? So to do that, I introduce and work with this relationship observed by Francesco Belli and others between the computed Eliashberg TC and this quantity called phi DOS, which I just call phi in this equation here. It basically measures the properties of the hydrogen sublattice in a hydride material. So it involves the electron localization function, the fraction of hydrogen, and the hydrogen contribution to the density of states at the Fermi level. So basically, as the hydrogen metallic sublattice is kind of enhanced, you get almost a linear enhancement of the computed superconducting Eliashberg TC. And, there's a pretty wide error bar of like plus or minus 60 Kelvin using this linear relationship. But when your goal, as our goal is like, TC's in the 200 Kelvin range, a plus or minus 60 Kelvin error bar isn't so bad. I'm happy if something I predict to be 200 Kelvin TC is really only 120 Kelvin, or the opposite way, 280 and 260. So to verify that this relationship, this methodology works on the systems I'm going to be studying, I did this for the simplest model structure, which I reproduce on the left here. So I chose this, R is lutetium, X is also lutetium, Y is oxygen. And so that gave me a ternary that I was able to find basically is harmonically stable at the DFT level at about 25 GPa. It has a large electron phonon coupling. Yeah, so really it's like that instability that someone just highlighted is it disappears at like 26 GPa. But the computed Eliashberg TC is 130 Kelvin, or sorry, 125 Kelvin. And the prediction using this linear relationship with these electronic properties was 130 Kelvin. So actually, it was pretty accurate. And for anyone curious, it was an S-wave gap. And furthermore, there's good reason to think that quantum nuclear effects will stabilize these structures and like bring the pressure needed down. I'll also mention that Fang and Uria and others studied the nitrogen version of this structure, and they found a similar correspondence where the what I call the network value TC was 100 Kelvin, and the Eliashberg computed TC was 99 Kelvin. So again, they found a good correspondence between the two. And they did include quantum nuclear effects. So my goal is simple. Well, first I'll mention another couple examples on the left. I looked at a couple ternaries with calcium and yttrium dominant doped rare earth hydrides, and I plot the partial densities of states, which you can see the hydrogen states in blue dominate the Fermi level in both cases. and their predicted network value TCs are 130, 140 Kelvin. So the goal was, well, I want to reach higher. So taking this formula, it sort of gives a heuristic on how to build structures with higher TC. So, for example, increase the fraction of hydrogen in the unit cell, this middle parameter here, and increase the relative contribution of the hydrogen density of states at the Fermi level. And so those considerations led to this second model structure. And then the final thing was increasing the hydrogen connectivity, which is parameterized by the electron localization function in a specific way. And that led to further, tweaking of the structure to induce like a particular kind of symmetry breaking of the hydrogen that leads to a more connected lattice with as measured by the electron localization function. And with these different structures, I was able to successively increase what kind of network value TCs I was getting. So for the second structure, one example that I studied in the listed publications here is nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride. It has very flat bands around the Fermi level, and these are actually hydrogen-dominant bands, which is very interesting. They're hydrogen dominant, but they're not like, molecular hydrogen or anything like that. So very strong hydrogen presence at the Fermi level. I compare the density of states magnitude to between the structure and H3s. So H3s is in black in this middle plot here, and this nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride is orange, and you can see the Van Hove singularity is, the peak of the density of states is much sharper, much bigger, whether or not you use pure DFT or DFT plus U, which enhances it in the top. So the other thing is, I'll mention the network value TC is around 165 to 180 Kelvin, depending on if you account for correlation effects or not. And I'll mention in a follow-up work, quantum effects, we found quantum nuclear effects seem to stabilize the structure at about 2 GPa. So with regular density functional perturbation theory, there are imaginary modes implying the system is unstable, but using the stochastic self-consistent harmonic approximation, those frequencies are positive. And this is a big supercell, 128 atoms. So great. Another example might be of this second model structure is doped scandium trihydrides, where I have like calcium and oxygen, and I'm looking at 20 GPa, and the density of states is again hydrogen dominated with an estimated TC of 180 Kelvin. So I get this question a lot, so I have it now in the main slides, which is, what about synthesis, right? Well, for the nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride example, there are a couple things I'd like to point out in the literature. One is ARPES studies that show a flat band right under the Fermi level, basically agreeing with the placement and energetics of the model we have. And in fact, the authors of this preprint, did the same modeling as us and found the same result. Found that the structure I'm working with matched their results the best. And then there's this other experimental report where actually characterization of a nitrogen-doped lutetium trihydride was synthesized. It was 1.3 weight percent nitrogen, and It's actually, there's a little old, it's not just nitrogen near the surface. I reached out to the authors, and the nitrogen was distributed homogeneously throughout. And so it shows that, and they found this to be FCC still, even though a lot of basically every theoretical prediction out there suggested that you couldn't have nitrogen doping and have the lattice remain FCC at ambient pressures. But it goes to show, I think these quantum nuclear effects are very important in the modeling of the stability of these systems. So a couple other examples. Basically, if you take, say, the formula I showed a couple slides ago, and you fill in scandium and calcium and hydrogen in certain positions, there's still an amount you can plug and play with these last two Y and Z dopants, which are, say, these green dots here and these red dots here. And you can still plug and play and get hydrogen dominated, sublattices, metallic sublattices, whether it be, nitrogen and hydrogen, or nitrogen and nothing, or oxygen and hydrogen, or oxygen and nothing. Like in all these cases, the blue curves are the dominant contributors at the Fermi level. It's all metallic hydrogen sublattices. And, it is true at 20 GPa, there are a couple hydrogen-based unstable modes, but in our publication, to be published in PNAS, we show at 40 GPa, actually, these go away. And there's this question of, well, what would nuclear quantum effects do? Which unfortunately is too big a calculation for us to do at the moment. So moving on to the third model structure, the most complex, I have a lithium and nitrogen doped yttrium trihydride. So it has certain electronic properties, which are very interesting. Again, hydrogen dominated density of states. At ambient pressures, there are a couple unstable, mostly hydrogen based modes. If we look at the mode with the highest imaginary eigenvalue, we can perturb the system along those eigenvectors, which are hydrogen-dominated vibrations. And you can see it'll save energy at, say, 1 GPa. It'll save energy to distort. But at 5 GPa, it saves a lot less energy, and the hydrogen go much less far. And at 15 GPa, it's no longer saving any energy. The potential energy surface is very flat. So I would say fairly modest pressures where you'll be able to at least have this structure be metastable. The network value TC is predicted to be 185 Kelvin using the formula from before. It rises to 220 Kelvin with further doping, electron doping in this case. And I'll point out that actually a stoichiometry very close to this, cubic lithium doped yttrium almost trihydride, is already known to be stable. Riki Kataoka made it, synthesized it, kept it in his lab for at least a month, and he said it didn't decay or anything. So, forcing some nitrogen in is all you need to make, the stoichiometry I'm modeling here. So like there are some considerations. I think synthesis will require careful temperature control, maybe hydrogen or nitrogen gas pressure. But there are things known about like the nitridization properties of rare earth trihydrides that you know uh, people, experimentalists especially, can take advantage of. That might help for like a kinetic pathway to synthesize a metastable structure, which is important. Diamond is a metastable structure, right? So it's really a question of, can you synthesize it and will it decay or not? Great. I'll point out, even in the case of that 1 GPa potential energy surface, if you just solve the Schrodinger equation, for like a hydrogen or group of hydrogen atoms following a potential energy surface. And you've solved the Schrodinger equation for a potential like this, even with increasing anharmonicity, you still get ground state densities. Those are these blue curves, and the black curves are the anharmonic potential. These blue curves, these ground state densities, still peak, or are mostly concentrated in the high symmetry positions, even with a highly anharmonic or fairly anharmonic potential. Whether it be smooth at the bottom or sharp at these minima, even if the hydrogen distances are larger, you get very interesting ground state densities. And something I don't go into right now is even if you allow for these distortions, the system still remains metallic. It doesn't turn insulating. So, I think there's a very good argument that something like this structure will really be superconducting if you can synthesize it. Maybe under pressure, maybe not. So the conclusions are, the template structures that I show here, I think they provide a narrow but flexible, if that makes sense, like a structural space to explore possibilities, for theoretical modeling, especially, kind of in the Goldilocks zone of, not too narrow, not too wide, just right, for actually finding new superconductors. And here's a brief list of some of the good promising candidates for what I say are near ambient superconductivity, going, between 1 and maybe up to 40 GPa. But I think quantum nuclear effects actually affect this by about 10 to 15 GPa, bringing the range down. And again, some of these distortions that occur leave the system metallic, so it's not even clear if you would even destroy superconductivity if these distortions occurred. I'd like to thank friends and colleagues for discussions, for various organizations for supporting my work. And here are some of the relevant publications, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Adam. Very good. We have plenty of time for questions. Simply speak up, unmute yourself, use the chat, or raise your hand.
Maybe, yeah, I can ask one.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, maybe. So Adam, you basically give a lot of these supercell-based calculations, right? So for audience, maybe could you explain a little bit why you choose supercell? Because I mean, in principle, you can study doping effect using other virtual crystal approximation or some other method, right? So what's the pros and cons you
Right.
realize?
So that's a great point. So the key factor is that the virtual crystal approximation, by and large, might try and model a doping level on average. But I mean, other than the couple of theoretical problems with it, the actual arrangements of the atoms in these structures, like the arrangements of the nitrogen, for example, are purposefully chosen to create certain quantum interference effects, quantum destructive interference effects that lead to things like these flat bands near the Fermi level. Now, it's possible that the system isn't super reliant on such nitrogen organizations, but that's at least one of the reasons why VCA doesn't get you answers like this when you put in the same amount of nitrogen as in this example. Yeah, and there are a couple other theoretical reasons why VCA wouldn't work as well as, I mean, explicitly computing the supercells. And I've talked to people who did VCA analyses on, you know, a nitrogen-doped lutetium hydride, and in none of those studies do you see results like what this is.
So
Okay.
maybe a related question would be, how large a supercell could you consider for a full Eliashberg calculation? It depends on the size of your memory and so on.
Right. Yeah. For a reasonably accurate Eliashberg calculation, I feel like personally, like you probably can't get much larger than say a 16 atom cell like this PM3m. It relies heavily on the number of atoms and the symmetry of the system. So for the resources I've mostly had access to, I wasn't able to model anything larger than this. And our colleagues, even, you know, Ava Zurich, you know, and they have big resources and do Eliashberg calculations all the time, weren't able to do the same for, you know, this 128 atom structure. So, you know, I suspect we're, for the foreseeable future, going to be limited to these like 16 to 24, maybe 32 atom unit cells for the purposes of Eliashberg calculations, unless, you know, significant advances are made on the algorithmic side.
And even for the phonons, for the self-consistent phonons and for the quantum effects, they had to use machine learned potentials.
Right.
Structure.
Yeah, exactly. These results, they did do, I think it was something like 10,000, you know, full DFT runs of different configurations, which were then fed into a machine learning algorithm, which contributed another like 900,000 or so configurations to sample the configurational space in order to get this result on the nuclear quantum effects. So very new algorithmic development, very non-trivial calculations. Still took them a month to run it, even with all that. So yeah, I'm very grateful that we were able to collaborate with them on such a monumental calculation. And I don't think, you know, this type of calculation will be very common for the foreseeable future, especially for, like, you know, messing around with more 128 atom supercells like this, or, you know, etc. But very good point.
Okay, Sasha, and then Roald.
Hello, Adam.
Sasha?
Question about you said that you estimated hydrogen conductivity using specific electron localization function. Can you elaborate this part a little bit to understand better what did you do?
Sure. So the hydrogen connectivity. So I don't have a relevant picture here. I do in the archive about this, but essentially, the electron localization function kind of measures if you have an electron in, say, the origin of the unit cell, maybe it's this corner here, what is the likelihood of an electron to be, you know, somewhere else in a unit cell relative to that? But it, and how the math and theory ends up working out is this kind of measures the you can measure this against the localization properties of the homogeneous electron gas. And so what you find is it's not quite a density that you compute. It's what this gives us is like surfaces of connectivity of like hydrogen electrons. And what Francesco Belli and colleagues were able to do was they were able to classify different hydrides based on their electron localization function properties. And they were able to tell, like, were the hydrogens in the system having ionic bonds, like with host rare earth atoms? Were they having molecular, like covalent bonds with other hydrogen? Were they having covalent bonds with other atoms? Were they having metallic bonds with other hydrogen? Which was roughly measured by the ELF function between two hydrogens, connecting two hydrogens looking like the homogeneous electron gas, having the same ISO value. So I don't have relevant pictures, which would help immensely, but I would.
And this is at 0 temperature, isn't it?
Yeah, the DFT calculations would all be that are going into this would be at 0 temperature.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Sasha. Roald?
Yes, thanks for the talk, Adam. Your correlations are mostly of your density of states with that theoretical formula that you mentioned. So what correlations do you have of your TC with experimental TCs for other samples? In particular, you mentioned an yttrium lithium hydride, an yttrium lithium hydride that was made by a group. What is its TC?
Right. Great question. So that's so this structure that was made by this group in this exact stoichiometry, this structure is an insulator in the Y.9 lithium 0.1 H2.8. What they synthesized is an insulator. And what I argue is you turn it metallic by forcing nitrogen in vacancies and make it metallic with the hole doping, and then the TC would then rise dramatically. So in that respect, the comparison you're suggesting isn't quite right, but that's just a specific example. So for the broader question of how does this network value TC compare with experimental values, I can give you one example that I, funnily enough, removed from this presentation, which is this same methodology. If you use it for lanthanum H10, the cubic LaH10, that's superconducting at high temperatures. This same methodology gets you a predicted TC, network value TC of 190 Kelvin. And for people familiar in the audience, that's actually underestimating the superconducting TC of lanthanum H10 by 60 Kelvin or so, which is basically in the error bars of plus or minus 60 Kelvin, which is in the error bars of this methodology. So so applying the methodology for LaH10, the methodology I'm presenting here actually underestimated the experimental TC by 60 Kelvin. There are a couple other examples if you want, but that's the big one in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Maybe another way of asking the question is, there's a growing body of experimental data on lower temperature hydride superconductors that aren't part of this plot, right? I mean, you were focusing on the high temperature ones, which are very interesting, but there aren't very many examples for doing statistics. But there are low temperature hydrides. And so have you looked at that? Has anybody looked at that?
So that's a good question. I know I think it's hard because essentially this correlation between the network value TC and actual TCs for low temperature hydrides, which is the vast majority of them, is just kind of useless because of these error bars. Like we do have a linear correlation, but it kind of becomes just untrustworthy when you get below, 50 Kelvin or so. So if you ask me, does it agree with Eliashberg calculations at low temperatures for like yttrium trihydride at 20 GPa? I would say yes, it does agree. The Eliashberg calculation gives, it was like 20 Kelvin or so, and this method gives like 10 Kelvin plus or minus 60, right? So the real question, I guess I'm kicking the can down to how do Eliashberg calculations compare with experiments, right? Because all I'm basing this off of here really is how does this methodology compare with Eliashberg calculations? And the question you're posing is how do Eliashberg calculations compare with experiments, to connect the two. And that's a very valid question. There are cases where the Eliashberg calculations don't agree with experiment very well for a number of reasons, like anharmonic effects in palladium hydride, where the Eliashberg calculation has a higher TC, anharmonic effects lower the TC. When you
Also,
feed
I
it
would,
all
I would suspect that in some of those cases, and maybe many of those cases, it's harder to define an electronic hydrogen network. So the whole model sort of may break down because it's not a metallic like sublattice as you're defining it.
Yeah. I mean, the methodology that Francesco Belli lays out lays out in this paper is fairly straightforward until you start asking, real philosophical questions like, what can we really say? Can we really say where a hydrogen atom is in a lattice when its nuclear wave function is spread out, by like 0.2 or 0.3 angstroms of just quantum fluctuations. So there are questions to be asked with the interpretation. I agree.
More questions, comments?
I had one, it's Roald again.
Hi.
Show my picture. It is interesting that you mention that the hydrogens constitute a large part of the density of states of the Fermi level, the hydrogen network. And that's something we've been interested in for some time. Okay, so let's take that seriously. Throw away the scandiums and replace them by argons or whatever rare earth you want. Whatever noble metal, rather, noble gas that you want of about the same size. Will you, then you will have, the hydrogen lattice will have 3 more electrons than it has for the first scandium. But still, perhaps the band structure will not be that different. And have you ever tried something like that?
That's an interesting question. So I haven't tried it with noble gases. I feel like for a couple of reasons, I feel like it wouldn't actually bond. You wouldn't really be able to synthesize that except under maybe very special conditions. But and I expect it wouldn't really bond with the ionically transfer electrons to hydrogen in the same way. But in terms of looking at non-rare earth atoms, that is something I've done. So for example, in this formula here, I have R and I have X, and most of the examples I've shown you actually choose X to be this rare earth. That's the majority of the atoms, and then R is maybe a dopant like calcium or something like that. But I've looked at things like replacing rare earths with zirconium, which is you know, an extra valence electron that theoretically the hydrogens could take. But the problem I run into is for zirconium, the hydrogens don't take all of the electrons. There's still like like what ends up happening is zirconium d orbitals start dominating the density of states. I've also tried looking at like silicon doped silicon doped lutetium hydrides with nitrogen. And what happens there is the silicon covalently bonds with the hydrogen rather than ionically bonding, which probably significantly changes the like superconducting properties. I can still get systems where the hydrogen density of states dominates the Fermi level, but there is significant bonding with silicon, and so it would change things immensely. And I haven't been able to do like Eliashberg calculations, and I have been able to find like network value TCs for these larger heterostructures that do get as high as like 130, 150 Kelvin. So there are some possibilities with different kinds of atoms other than rare earths, but I think it's very the common denominator seems to be starting with this rare earth trihydride configuration, because of a couple things. It's already close to a bonding transition. The hydrogen are weakly ionically bonded to the rare earth in these trihydrides. So doping actually gives you a great amount of influence on the structures. And that's why we see such big changes with these heterostructures. And that's why I have to go to big heterostructures to model, you know, less doping amounts, you know, etc. It's a very complex topic, but I feel like for those of you, you know, anyone working with you, Rold, for example, who wants to experiment with doing exactly what you've said, a significant part of my work, I think, is making these model structures for you to try plugging and playing in exactly the way you're describing.
I would also try group 13 in general, that is meaning things like gallium, indium.
I have.
Yes.
So what happens there is gallium and indium, they bond covalently with the hydrogen in ways that, you know, can still lead to a significant number of hydrogen states at the Fermi level, but it's not quite as much as what I find with the rare earths. These covalent bonds seem to always result in a significant amount of the other orbitals, like the gallium p or the indium p orbitals, also at the Fermi level, which according to this formula at least will reduce TC. But I agree, it's worth playing with, and I've done some of it. I'm happy to talk with you separately about some of the results of those calculations, but I felt like they weren't worth putting into this paper.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Any more questions? Comments? If not, let's thank Adam once again, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Although thank you, Martin, for the claps.